Okay, hi everyone. I'm Rivka Weiss, and I'm the director of the clinic program at Kav Lenoir. On behalf of Kav Lenoir and La Marchav, I welcome all of you to this panel discussion in honor of the opening of our joint mental health clinic in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Thank you all for coming. Whether you're from Beit Shemesh or beyond, coming out to support emotional health for yourselves, your families, and your communities matters. Kav Lenoir is the leading provider of emotional health intervention, education, and support services in Israel. Our services are offered in French, English, Spanish, and Hebrew. Our partners at La Marchav are leading the way in bringing quality clinical services to the Israeli Haredi community. Tonight, we're coming together to learn about and appreciate emotional health for ourselves and our community. There's no stronger way to do that than with the opening of our clinic in Beit Shemesh, where costs are covered by the Kupot Cholim and services are offered in English and Hebrew. But that's just the beginning. We know that emotional health starts in partnership with communities, and that's why we're dedicated to growing our relationship with the community in Beit Shemesh. But we're not stopping there, and we hope to share the good news of even more Kupot-funded clinics and programming in communities all over the country. The topic for this evening is learning from Corona as a family. A lot has been spoken about the challenges that Corona has incurred, and I'm sure many of you have already attended webinars addressing this issue. But what we want to focus on tonight, as we begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel from this pandemic, is what we can learn and how we can grow from this experience as a family, with a particular focus on young children, teens, and couples. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have with us Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz, who's the founding dean of Yeshiva Darchei Noam of Monsey and director of Bright Beginnings. He's published child safety books that are in over 100,000 homes in 3 languages, as well as the groundbreaking Bright Beginnings Gemara and Chumash workbooks that are used in over 100 schools. Rabbi Horowitz conducts child abuse prevention and parenting workshops in Jewish communities around the world and received the prestigious 2008 Covenant Award in recognition of his contribution to Jewish education. He joins us all the way from the United States. Thank you for joining.
Nice to be here, really nice.
Holly Rosenbaum is an individual and couples therapist. She's the author of over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on intimacy. Together with Dr. David Ribner, she co-authored the book, I Am For My Beloved, A Guide to Enhanced Intimacy for Married Couples. She co-hosts a monthly podcast with Rabbi Scott Kahn called Intimate Judaism. Thanks for joining. Dr. Zev Gans completed postgraduate training in individual and family therapy with a focus on working with young children and their families, as well as the treatment of child sexual abuse. He's a certified practitioner of the attachment-based model child-parent psychotherapy and has lectured and published widely on the topic of attachment and families. Zev currently serves as a clinical supervisor and instructor at the Family Institute of Neve Yerushalayim, a lecturer at Machon Shiluv, and maintains a private practice in Ramat Beit Shemesh and Jerusalem. He is most significantly Rosh Tzevet of the new Kav Lenoir La Marchav Mental Health Clinic in Ramat Beit Shemesh, and I'd like to invite him to say a few words about our clinic. Dr. Gans.
Okay, thanks, Rivka. First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Horowitz, Tali for joining us. I'm very excited about this event. I think these are 2 people with a tremendous amount of expertise who we can all learn a lot from. I want to say something about the clinic that we've just opened. The idea of our clinic is to provide mental health services to everyone in the community, irrespective of socioeconomic status, regardless of whether one can afford a private therapist or not. And based on the response that we've had in our first few months of opening, this was a real need in our community. To that end, I want to just very quickly thank the people who are instrumental in opening this clinic. Eli Rothstein, the executive director of Kav Lenoir, Moshe Cohen, the director of La Marchav, Rivka Weiss, our moderator, who the clinical program director at Kav Lenoir, and Sivan Semach, who is the Minahelet of La Marchav Beit Shemesh. It's not easy to join 2 organizations. And it's not obvious that it can happen. The fact that it did is because that the people who I just mentioned work without ego and are interested in the benefit of the community. And I'm really the beneficiary of all the hard work that they put in. The other thing that I want to say about our clinic is this. I have received a number of calls in these first few months saying something like this. We're really excited about the clinic. It's very, very important. But typically, you get what you pay for. And so I'm nervous about coming to a clinic where you don't have to pay for therapy. And as an axiom, you get what you pay for often usually makes sense. But what I want to emphasize is that that's not the case here. Our clinic is staffed by therapists who have a tremendous amount of experience, expertise. This is not cut-cost therapy. These are people who have their own private practices, who honestly could be doing something more lucrative by putting more time and effort into their private practices, but spend the time, but choose to work for us for three reasons. One is a desire to give back to the community. Two is a desire to work together with a team, and three is a desire to continue learning. And so the therapists that you're getting are not only highly experienced, skilled therapists, they're highly passionate ones. That's, I guess, in introducing ourselves to the community, that's the message that I really want to give. And by the way, Rivka, we also have therapy in Yiddish and Swiss German for all the Swiss people out there. So that's just a little addendum. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time, so I'll hand this back to you now, Rivka.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gans. We invite you to submit questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat option. And we'll leave time at the end for actually raising your hand, asking live questions, or submitting throughout and then addressing them at the end. This will be recorded, so if you'd like to remain anonymous, please change the name at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so let's begin. Rabbi Horowitz, I'd like to start with you. Sure. As evident by the format of this webinar, we've really grown accustomed to working from home via the computer. And it seems that this might become the beginning of a new era of moving our office more to our homes. How do you feel this has impacted the family from your experience?
So again, thanks again for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, with your audience. Ramat Beit Shemesh is like my second home in Israel. I spent a lot of time there, and I hope to come back. I had a few trips scheduled over the past 10 months that had to be canceled, so I hope we'll be back up soon. I think, everything is changing. Everything has changed. I think in some ways, it's hard when you're like in the middle of history to appreciate it. Maybe 20 years from now, they'll look back and notice changes in different ways. I think that the changes that are happening in terms of working at home and family, how this impacts families for good and some challenges, I think COVID accelerated the changes that were happening already. We were going to get to this place eventually anyway, where more people worked from home and there was, distance learning and all of that. But it accelerated, what would have taken a generation, basically, into 2 months. So I think it really does offer opportunities for family where parents are home more. Especially folks that were commuting an hour and a half to work each day, or spending long hours in the office, get to be home with their children. There are obviously, complicating factors also. But I really encourage families, parents, to look at it as an opportunity, but one that needs to be managed. People would say, why do you have your phone? When smartphones first became a little more popular. Why do you carry your phone all the time? It's, you bring your work into your life and you never turn it off. And I say, you just need to be able to manage it. The fact of the matter is that I'm able to sit down with my kids and spend more time with them, knowing that I can jump away when I need to go to work. So I think families should have honest conversations with their children, which includes the fact that sometimes I'm going to be in a meeting, and even though I'm home, the door has to be closed because I need to concentrate on work. And I'm sure children, thank God my wife and I, we're empty nesting now, which is basically like a Shana Rishina or a honeymoon, but you don't get supper. But it's a wonderful stage in our life, and we're really not hands-on. It didn't impact us this way. Quite to the contrary, it allows us to interact with our grandchildren more. But I think parents should have these conversations with children in terms of what it looks like, why I have to be away, and to set ground rules with the children so that we can work on that. It also it forces us to be more self-aware, and that's another thing I really encourage parents to think about, is the fact that because we're around the house, so much, it really could lend itself, the situation could lend itself where we find it more difficult to be in control of our reactions to the children all the time. You don't have that optimum. If you're working in an office and you come home and say, okay, these 2 hours are devoted to the kids, you put on your smiley face and you do what you got to do. If you're home all day, it's not going to be like that. So maybe a conversation with the children is helpful, and to be self-aware. If you're finding it difficult and if you're finding yourself snapping at the kids, it's time to reach out for help. That's also, I think it's an opportunity, it's a challenge. And look, things will get back to normal in other ways. I don't think we'll ever go back to the way it was in 2019. I think that's pretty clear to all of us. Please.
I think what you're really touching on is the idea of boundaries and redefining and reestablishing boundaries in a way that we've never had to do before. I want to ask you, Tali, about the impact that you feel that this has had on couples, both for good and for bad.
Okay. Do you see me? Because I'm having a little trouble with my computer, so I don't see anything but black right now. Okay. But you see me?
We see you. You're great.
Okay, great. Okay, so your question was about the impact of Corona on marriages. And the truth is that the impact of working is really one that is not just about work. I mean, home is no longer just a place for work. It's a place for school. It's a place for everything happening now at once at home. And what you were saying, Rabbi Horowitz, before about this was going to be the trend of the future anyway, I think the difference is that this kind of came upon us without choice. And I think that for people for whom home is a refuge. For some people, work is a refuge. It's a place to go to get away from home. And so that place is no longer, that ability to leave is no longer available. People have different kinds of marriages. Some people thrive on a marriage in which one partner leaves for America 2 weeks out of every month. And the person is home all the time. They thrive on very specific gender roles or specific roles for each parent. Suddenly, that's completely changed. Couples are different. We have couples who are kind of avoidant of conflict, and we have couples who are very, very high conflict. So I recently had a couple who said to me, it used to be that we only had to deal with each other from 5 in the afternoon till 10 at night. And now we have to deal with each other 24 hours a day. So I think that what we need to remember is a few things. When we talk about families, we have different kinds of families. And when we talk about couples, at least, there's a couple. We have all different kinds of couples, but we can't forget a certain demographic, which is singles. Singles are very lonely. Many of them have given up their apartments because, why pay all this rent for an apartment in Nachlaot when there's nothing happening in the shuk? And so a lot of older singles have moved home, and this is very difficult socially. It's very difficult in terms of the family structure. We have to keep in mind that a lot of what makes people be able to get through this period, and you talked about this being an enormous change. Fact is that we are experiencing a great deal of stress. And what helps people get through stress is connection, is the connection that they have. And if you're in a good marriage with a good attachment, with good security, then you can rely on your partner. You can rely on your partner to help you soothe, and you can soothe your partner, and you have that source of strength. But in marriages that haven't had that, that tendency could get worse. So the idea being that if you're in a good marriage and you have a lot of good resources, you can use those resources to be able to survive and thrive. But if you have difficulties in your marriage to begin with, the corona has definitely perpetuated and intensified some of those challenges. So that's really the answer to the first question. It's not only about work at home. Many people have lost jobs. They've lost income, and couples have had to kind of reorganize around that. So, there's definitely the bad news, but there's also the good news. The bad news is that there's a great deal of stress and distress and grief. People are grieving. We all know somebody who has died from corona. A lot of people in our neighborhood have lost parents, and the ability to be able to talk about that and recognize what you're feeling. These are important resources. So that's also we talked about the boundaries. Israeli society is pretty bad when it comes to boundaries anyway, between work and home. And now, there's almost no boundaries between work and home. There are Zooms every night, and you can just some people's work will send them an invitation for a Zoom. Every evening they're trying to put the kids to bed and they have a Zoom. So being able to create those boundaries. Conflict. There's going to be a lot of conflict, especially when we're at each other's feet all the time. Who's going to get what room, and who's going to get the internet, and I think that for many couples and many families, they found ways to avoid conflict. And suddenly there's no way to avoid conflict. And there's going to be conflict, and that's okay. I think that the resilience and the strengths are learning how to be able to resolve those conflicts, and also being able to fight, but recover from those fights, because we're not always going to be our best selves during corona. So in order to answer the question that you asked about, what do you do? First of all, we need to recognize our feelings, be very self-aware, and recognize what might be going on with our partner. One of the big conflicts that came up a lot in couples therapy is the differences that partners have around corona regulations, where one person will be wanting to have their kids over and wanting to go out places, and the other one will be very, very strict and have a great deal of anxiety. And I think that being able to recognize that your partner's not trying to be controlling, but recognize that your partner's feeling a great deal of anxiety, and being able to show empathy and compassion for that, taking the opportunities to not take each other for granted, always give a lot of appreciation, have a sense of humor, take the opportunity to learn new things about each other. Partners are finding each other interacting more in each other's lives because they're there. And so things that you might normally share with your partners at work because it has to do with your work, you're now becoming sharing more with your partner. So that has advantages, that has disadvantages, because we all need space away as well. So navigating all that, I think I gave you a very long answer. So
I think you're really highlighting the need for self-awareness as individuals and as a couple, how we're experiencing this new reality. Dr. Gens, can I ask, from your work with children, how would you say the kind of families being locked down in the home, spending a lot of time at home together, how would that impact sibling relationships?
So it's interesting. At the end of the first lockdown, a few colleagues and I ran a study on sibling relationships, an informal study that would never get published, excuse me, in a peer-reviewed journal. And then we got busy and we never analyzed the data. But in eyeballing the data, what emerges very, very clearly is that at the end, when this was gathered around, I would say May, June, something like that, there was an overwhelming majority of parents who reported that sibling relationships at home improved, which was surprising to me. Well, in retrospect, it was both surprising and not surprising, because it conformed anecdotally with a lot of what I had heard, both in my practice and just from around. I think at that point in time, people were really marshaling resources and trying to do something different with their families, and that had an impact on sibling relationships in general. I think that's the key component to think about when we think about siblings, and sibling relationships, sibling conflict, sibling rivalry, is that the relationships between siblings is often a thermometer to signal of something deeper that is either going on in a child or multiple children, and more generally in the family. A concept that I find very useful here is displacement, which is an ego defense that was identified by Freud 100 years ago. And basically what displacement is just as it sounds. I mean, think about, a guy at work gets yelled at by his boss. He can't yell back at his boss, so he goes home and he yells at his wife, or he kicks the dog. Essentially, displacement is when we have an impulse that can't be output onto onto its source, and so we displace it on somewhere that it can be. So if you think about siblings, if you think about kids who are often powerless and have all different types of feelings, often angry feelings, often scared feelings that can't be expressed onto the actual source of who it is or where it is that they're feeling. The easiest expression of those feelings are the people who are most proximate and most easily accessible, most controlled, and those are usually siblings. And so when we think about the nature of what's going on between siblings, we really need to be thinking about what is going on in these two, inside these two children, how that's being expressed in the relationship as a whole. Now, when we think about this in terms of the pandemic, we need to think about how has the pandemic influenced the anxiety levels of our children, and how is that being expressed in the relationship between siblings? Again, it's hard to give one very clear answer to how that was expressed. But my sense is that as the lockdowns went on, as our resources were exhausted, as sort of these interventions that families made to change things kind of atrophied, my sense is that sibling relationships went back to a baseline. Now, in terms of where it's going to go, as Rabbi Horowitz mentioned, it's difficult when you're in it. It's difficult to know where it's going to go. My sense is that in actual sibling relationships, what happened during these past 9-10 months may not have all that massive a difference, right? The relationships are older, even if they're young kids, they're older than a year, right? That means that the dynamics within the relationships were created over a long stretch of time. And probably that'll go back to status quo. I think there's an important takeaway here, which is something that I suppose we knew before, and that is that sibling rivalry, sibling conflict is often, not always, but is often responsive to connection in the family being felt as a scarce commodity. Very often sibling rivalry is expressed through the words "it's not fair," which connotes a sort of a struggle over physical resources. And usually it has not nothing to do with that, but usually these physical resources, who gets to play Xbox, or who bought this shirt, or whatever it is, are really a proxy for something much deeper. And that's really the extent to which connection is there in abundance and need not be fought over. So I think that's something that was really, again, something we knew already, but something that was really reinforced, particularly during that first part of lockdown, when families really made many efforts to sort of change how they operated, when there was more of a focus on the family. And I think that was expressed in changes in sibling relationships.
Thank you. And I think, what you're saying, a takeaway from that is that it's an opportunity for parents to learn more about what's going on in the family climate and be able to tap into that. Rabbi Harwitz, it was mentioned already by Dr. Gans, by Tali, about the increased stress levels and anxiety levels. So how would you say that you feel Corona has impacted the general emotional and mental well-being of individuals?
So, I happen to have read something from the CDC today that was really frightening. I don't know if you've seen it about, the CDC here in America, about the percentage of children who've considered harming themselves. I believe they wrote 1 out of 4 over this period of time. Now, that, like any information, it needs context, of course. What does harming mean? But it clearly has brought a whole new level of stress. And that Dr. Tversky, when I started dealing with teens at risk in the 90s, Dr. Abraham Tversky was incredibly gracious. He mentored me. We spent so much time together. I'm forever grateful to him. And he once said that we were talking about adolescence. So he said, all houses look good when they're brand new. He said, when you get the first storm, then you see how well they're constructed. He said, adolescence is the hurricane. That's what he said. And he said, you should encourage parents when you do classes and mentor your families to really work on their relationships and strengthen them and have everything right by the time adolescence comes, because the patio furniture is flying already by then. You gotta have everything. And so, like, whatever stress level there's been in many, I would imagine many or most families, it's certainly, from what I'm seeing, it's gotten worse. There's the levels of drinking, alcohol use, substance abuse among parents. Forget the kids. Is off the charts. I mean, just do a Google search just Google, Corona, substance abuse, domestic violence, all of it, So of course it brings stress. I think the best thing that parents could do is to really talk to your kids, really explain things to them. We think that the children understand and they read between the lines. They don't necessarily understand why we're stressed out. They don't understand. They just see that things are different. So I've always felt that education is the key to everything, to explain what's going on. One of the things that the way I think about it, Shlomo HaMelech says, Ani bina li gevura. It's one of my 5 favorite psukim in Tanakh. Ani bina li gevura. With wisdom, with bina, with wisdom comes strength. And parents not being prepared for all of this leads them to get stressed and feeling that they don't have the tools. They're not empowered to be able to deal with it. And counsel, same thing with the children, to really have these conversations. The analogy I always think of is, if someone from a developed country takes a shower, a shave, washes their hands, and touches an electric appliance and gets a shock, so they have a certain level of pain. If someone from a third world country who never saw electricity did the exact same thing, they have the same pain, but they don't understand what happened. So in other words, they both get the jolt, but someone who grew up with electricity, you say, oh, shouldn't have done that, should have wiped my hands. The fellow who never saw electricity before thinks that maybe at 8:45, every Monday night, I'm going to get zapped from now on. Or the gods are angry at me. It makes no sense to them. So explaining, the grieving cycles, if your child is grieving, look up the Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of grieving. Explain it to your children that this is normal. It's normal to feel a certain way. It's normal to feel this way when we're together. So I believe that education is the key to everything. But I think it's so important to be cognizant of the fact that we're under stress, to talk about it and say we're also under stress. And parents, it's tough because we're we ourselves are under stress, but we really have a tremendous opportunity to model resiliency. I've been informally studying resiliency for 30 years now, because it's just something that's fascinated me, especially working with abuse survivors. You know, you see 10, God forbid, 10 kids who got abused, you know, some of them, chas v'shalom, God forbid, just fall apart. Some of them are, you know, limp along, and then one of them is lecturing and starting organizations, and, you know, writing books. And like, what is it that, what's inside the box? I spoke to Dr. Tversky about it a lot. You know, what's inside the box? But I do think we have a real opportunity to teach resilience. You know, my mother was one of the most resilient, Allah was one of the most resilient people I ever met in my life. You know, she was widowed at a very young age, and she didn't have children for 10 years before that, and she had, you know, a number of rambunctious kids that she was raising on her own for 10. And I believe that you pick up stuff by, you know, you pick up resiliency by people around you. My wife and I, we had an issue in the family, the overall family, when our kids were teenagers, and we kept telling each other, the kids are watching us. You know, they're watching how we respond. You have an opportunity to teach children that we'll get through this together. It's going to be difficult, but we'll get to the other side. So I think this whole, one of the things that I'd like to do over the next few weeks is bring up this whole issue of resiliency for parents and for children. But I think if you talk about opportunities, I think it's a real opportunity to teach our children the value of resiliency.
As you're speaking about resilience, I'm remembering, I don't know if you guys remember, when we first started with Corona was about 9 months ago. And I remember a couple of friends talking about flying home to visit their parents overseas, and them saying, oh, I'm never going to do that because we're going to have to quarantine with our kids for 2 weeks. There's no way we're surviving 2 weeks at home with our kids. And
10 months later.
And here we are, right? And we're doing this
later.
At a time, right? And I just think that it shows us so much about the elasticity and the adaptability of human beings.
I know, I'm interested in hearing, you know, what Zev and Talia are going to say about the other things, but very quickly, I was at a Covenant Foundation retreat a few years ago, and they had a fellow who wrote a book. He's a professor at Harvard, and he wrote a book about tying resiliency to grandparents. It was fascinating that kids who had close relationships with their grandparents were all grandparents out there. It promoted resilience. He did a study that was peer reviewed. He had more time than you do, I guess, than we do. But he did a study.
Academic position.
I'm sorry?
He had an academic position. He could do it.
I was just going to tell you, he got an endowment there. Right. But what he did was he discovered that, and they teased it out. Why is that so? And they discovered that families had like almost a Torah Shabbal Peh, like an oral history of the family. And having grandparents allowed the kids to hear how they went through the Depression or the World War. And that became part of the DNA of the family, that we get through stuff. So I think grandparents have a really important role to play, possibly by helping your grandchildren get on with them and encourage resiliency. I'm sorry, go.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Tali, can I ask you to talk about, expand a little bit on this notion of resilience in couples?
Sure. I mean, I look at resilience a little bit differently, in the sense that I think that, you know, we're not quite there yet. We're still in the crisis. We are still in it. And while we're still in it, I think we have great strength in our adaptability and in our ability to survive. I think that resilience comes a little bit later, when we are able to make meaning out of what we all experienced. And making that meaning means that we need to be in a place of reflection. I don't think we're there yet. It's very difficult to be in a place of reflection when we are still in a place of survival. I anticipate that we've begun this process, and I anticipate that we will get there, where we will be able to look back and say, what did I feel? How did I act? What do I regret? What do I take responsibility for? What are the life lessons that I have learned, that we have learned individually as couples, as families, as communities. How do we make meaning from this crisis? We adapt in order to survive, but we thrive with our resilience, with our ability to reflect, to also look at our narrative and make sure that that's really our narrative. Take real responsibility for the story that happens to us. And then we have our values that have changed. Health is more important than money. Time with our family is actually something, really valuable. We've learned how to resolve, hopefully, we've learned how to resolve conflict, because underneath this amount of stress, we cannot always be our best selves. And so we will sometimes, not be able to regulate ourselves emotionally. We need to be able to take responsibility for that and to forgive ourselves and to forgive each other.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Gens, we've seen that recently, due to a lot of homeschooling that's happening, parents are more involved in their children's education. So what can you tell us about that? Has that been a positive development? How do you view that?
Okay, so I actually think this is somewhat connected. I'll broaden the question and think about it in terms of how kids have related to being homeschooled, to distance learning, how parents have reacted to that. I think that it's very much related to this notion of resilience. One concept that I find useful in thinking about resilience is a term that was coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb and popularized by Jonathan Haidt, which is the concept of anti-fragility. And if you think about the anti-fragility, if you think about something fragile, think about like a china plate. China plate is fragile. If you put a certain amount of stress on it, it cracks. Right? It's not going to grow. It's not going to get stronger from that stress. If you think about a muscle is anti-fragile. Right? If you put a moderate amount of stress on the muscle doesn't just survive, it grows. Kids are anti-fragile, right? Kids grow from stress. And I think that's a takeaway that is, it's an encouraging takeaway, I think, from this time. Now, I think the way that relates to schooling is that we have to look at how how distance learning has impacted each kid, and it's really not universal. I don't have any hard data on this, but I suspect that what's going to emerge as we look at this is that it was really, when people do really intricate studies on this, we're going to see that there was a really varied impact on kids depending on a lot of factors. And so, for example, what I've seen is that kids who have some social anxiety, who pre-pandemic were not interconnected into a dense web of relationships, they've really struggled during the pandemic. And for the very simple reason is that in order to maintain social connection during this time period, kids have had to really work hard to keep those contacts. If you have some social anxiety, it's going to be, you're not going to be incentivized to do that. And so I'm seeing among latency age kids, young teenagers, massive amounts of gaming addiction since the onset of the pandemic. Gaming, video games are really a very easy way to manage the anxiety, manage loneliness. On the other hand, there's some kids who've really thrived. A lot of kids on the spectrum have done actually quite well. Seemingly, again, this is my own speculation, but seemingly because going into school and having to deal with social connection is just agonizing for kids on the spectrum. It doesn't make any sense, and it's often very calming. There's certain kids with ADHD who've also really benefited from distance learning. I don't know if they've learned anything, but they have. But the having some distance from the source of stress, source of anxiety, which is school, has really sort of lightened the load. and so I think parental involvement needs to really focus on the unique needs of each child. Again, it's once again, it's something that we knew. I mean, Chanoch l'nar al pi darko is sort of like the maxim that everyone, will champion. So knowing that isn't that difficult. Implementing it is much more difficult. On the level of the school, I have less expertise on that. I would actually, want to hear more from Rabbi Horowitz as to how schools do that. Parents need to know that they are the only ones, literally the only ones in the world who have their kids' well-being as their sole motivating factor. Schools might be well-meaning, but the kid that particular kid is among many, many kids, and there are lots of different schools are incentivized to do different things. Parents need to know that if they want their kid to get the unique and special attention that child needs with their the unique factors that come with that specific child, they're the only ones that are really going to advocate for that kid.
So, Rabbi Hartz, I want to direct this question at you, but I also want to add to that the idea that with schooling, there's been, and even not related to schooling, there's been increased exposure to technology for kids and teens recently. Do you think that when we think of post-pandemic, do you think that we can, as parents, go back to the limits and boundaries from before the pandemic? How do we deal with this new reality of increased exposure?
Hey, wait, you were talking about the gaming, folks, the gaming chair is? I was shopping for an office chair. They have these gaming chairs so you can sit 15 hours a day there. Look, I think we should. I think parents, I would encourage parents to, depending on the situation, perhaps the increased technology use is a good thing for now. In other words, that if you have children who are who are stressed and gaming, for example, relaxes them or gives them a, it's always parents say, should I let my child go out with some friends, whatever, fill in the blank. Should I let my child go in the good times? Matzah Shabbos, they want to go out. I say, you didn't finish the question. What happens if you say no? Right? So it's not a question in isolation. Should I let my kids? I have a 14-year-old son, an 18-year-old son. Should I let him go to the pizza shop and hang out with his friends? What happens if you say no? What are they going to do then? So unfortunately, for many families, the options really are not great. You may be living in a smaller apartment, and you might have more children and less resources and less help. So I think in the short term, depending on the child and depending on the family, I think we should try to get through this and deal with what you said, Rivka, what you correctly said about getting boundaries back to where they were before in terms of technology use. That might be something that you'd want to deal with a little bit later. Again, depending on the family. If everything is right and the kids are okay, you should be enforcing, getting collaboratively less technology use if possible. How to get it back? I've always felt that technology rules are best done collaboratively, where parents sit down with children and discuss it with them rather than issue, from on high. One of the things I've been doing this with parents for 15, 20 years almost, to encourage the parents to sit down with the kids, hand them a few index cards and say, why do you think we don't want you to have this technology device? So what are our concerns around it? And have the children write down a few reasons and flip the card over as they come up with a solution. How can you allay our fears? How can you allay our concerns? Rather than just say, this is the way it is and these are the rules we made. I got the idea years and years ago. I read some research on office rules, and office rules that have input from the workers are 7 times more likely to be followed. So, that's something I've always encouraged parents to do is to really talk to the children, explain your reasons, and maybe they'll come up with a creative solution. They might wind up when you ask them what happens if you don't listen, they might be more machmer than you are. They'll tell you, you can take away my phone for 2 weeks. If you try doing that, they would just explode. So it's a process. Al regalachas, I think, Tali, you said right now we got to do what we, in terms of the resilience that we're not there yet. It was a very wise comment, and thank you for sharing it. I think right now, families need to function and get through what they have to get through and deal with the other things which are optimal later. And when that time comes, wean them off slowly, bring them into the process, explain why things are different, give them some choices rather than tell them, here's what it's going to be from now on. Some children will do better if they get on the internet for a half hour before they do their homework. Some kids would rather get their homework done and play later. So the parents should be flexible in setting rules in a good time, but in this time, I think just getting through this and getting to the other side and functioning as a family is probably the most important thing.
Tali, I want to ask you a question that came from the audience. Couples who used to have a ritual of date night, who do not have that opportunity right now, whether it's due to lockdown, restaurants being closed, etc. Do you have any suggestions for couples to, like you said, kind of counter that stress by forming connection and soothing one another?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because couples need their space together. And, we have the problem of having too much space, but we also have the problem of not having enough space alone. And this has been discussed a lot on different forums. Sometimes you just have to say to your kids, this is our time and we're going into the bedroom and we're just going to be alone for a while because it's our time. And, I think that we could take that where we want to take that in terms of our imagination. But, it's okay for kids to know that, that parents have an emotionally intimate life as well as a physically intimate life. And that, sometimes they just want to be alone together. And it's not always easy to create that. And that's really been an issue for many couples, especially it depends a lot on the resources. If you're an empty nester, like Rabbi Horowitz and his wife, and you're fortunate and you have a nice big house, then obviously your reality is much different than young couples with small children who are home all day and then need to be put to bed and they're exhausted. And by the way, these often are the couples that are drinking and smoking more weed. And, these are the things that we're dealing with and that we're seeing a lot of. It's definitely a difficult period. I think that being able to somehow make those boundaries for yourself, somehow manage to even get in the car and take a drive, just the two of you, if you can do that, without getting fined, or take walks is really, really important. To take walks with your partner and use that as time to talk, but really making that time, creating that space to be able to communicate and reconnect.
Dr. Gens, another question from the audience. We talked about boundaries and Rabbi Horowitz, educating and communicating and this kind of joint discussions about different things. What about kids who are challenged in that area, clinically challenged, have a hard time with boundaries, have a hard time communicating or accepting authority? Do you have any suggestions for how to deal with kids like that?
Well, I guess I'll be a little snarky in answering this question. I think that first, what's important for parents to recognize is sometimes they can't handle sometimes boundaries can't be enforced. Sometimes we fail as parents. One of the things that I think Rabbi Horowitz touched on this before, and I'm encountering again and again is the guilt that parents place on themselves when they have particularly challenging kids, and all the rules of parenting don't work, and they go to parenting shiurim, and they listen to the rules and they read the books, and it doesn't work. One of there's a parenting meme that has gone out, especially in the frum community, which is that Hashem doesn't give us children that we can't handle. I understand where that's coming from, and I can understand how it's reassuring. I'm not sure I really, well, maybe true. I'm not really sure I like that message, because I think it actually provokes more guilt than anything else. What happens is we often fail with our kids, and we can't enact the boundaries, and the kids don't act like they're supposed to, and we're left feeling, well, I guess I failed. I think Hashem does give us challenges that we can't handle, and sometimes, or at least we feel like we can't handle, and sometimes we fail at them. It's difficult for me to, it's difficult for me to answer al regel achat, the question of how do we enact boundaries for kids who don't listen, because sometimes, especially in times of high stress, especially with kids who are who have particular challenges, the rules just don't work. And I think that the first step is having a degree of compassion for ourselves when they don't work. I know you're going through these past few months. I don't have an empty nest. I have 5 children at home, and thank God they're good kids. But I'm often sort of looking up to this, looking up what do I don't know what to do here. Like everything that I've tried just hasn't worked. I think society predisposes us to the collective messaging around parenting predisposes us towards guilt. One of my favorite studies is the outcome of the study showed that parents, I don't know how they did this, but parents spend more time with their kids nowadays and feel, as compared to previous generations, and feel more guilty about the time that they spend with their kids. So we are constantly bombarded with the messaging of guilt that if our kids don't turn out the way they're supposed to, that's on us. We have a lot of impact on our kids, and it's important for us to take parenting seriously. But it's also important for us to, recognize that they're independent human beings, and sometimes what we do, won't be effective in the way that we conceptualize.
I think you're bringing up, just to kind of sum up as we're nearing the end of our webinar. And by the way, I invite people from the audience to either raise a hand and speak live or to submit a Q&A. Is the dialectic between, on one hand, having that self-compassion, accepting that this is really a challenging time and there are going to be moments and days or even weeks of tremendous stress and not knowing how to handle things, but at the same time also trying to tap into moments of creating resilience, growth, conversation, maximizing this time we have as a family with our kids, with our spouses, but kind of trying to find that healthy balance of recognizing that both pieces are so much a part of this experience. I want to ask, as we wait for the questions to trickle in, I wanted to ask, just to sum up from each of our panelists, if you could sum up one valuable takeaway from Corona, what would that be? Rabbi Horowitz, begin with you.
So I think if we asked Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the head of the Muslim movement, or as far as their own introspection, I would say it's understanding other people's lives. And we absolutely don't get it. It's not possible to get it. I believe, Tali, you spoke about singles. You know what it's like. Was it you, Zev? Tali? You did. And, I remind myself of, we made Pesach for 20 years, Kanei Nahara, with our children. And then I got a few gigs at Pesach hotel programs. And I'll never forget, we were in Tucson, Arizona, at a program. I was walking the golf course with my wife, Erev Shabbos, Erev Yantif, and we were making phone calls to our family, and everybody else was rushing, to get off the phone. And I found myself saying, I'm average intelligence. We made Pesach. I know what it's like, right? And like, what's the rush? I'm serious. because we weren't making it then. We just didn't people, oh, I'm so busy. And people would come, a few weeks before Pesach, you say, really? Yeah, I know. And I'm compassionate and empathetic. And read all the right books about empathetic listening, but you really don't get it if you're not there. So I don't think, it's funny. I don't think that I really understand families with 4 teenagers at home. I'm trying to understand, at least I know that I don't understand, which is the first step, but I really don't understand. I don't think any of us, if you're not single, understands what it's like to be alone, during this time and the stress that puts. You mentioned about giving up apartments. A lot of folks are in their apartments. Nobody wants them because they're afraid of they have elderly parents or somebody with a condition. I left my phone on for Shabbos and Yantif since March. Since the onset, there was talk. A lot of us, and my colleagues and I were talking about our fear of Chas v'Shalom, what a 3-day Yantif would do to people who are by themselves. And I would post a note on social media. My phone is on. If you want to get in touch, email me for the number. And what was fascinating was 95%, maybe more, of the people who contact me before Yantif to ask for the number of Shabbos didn't call. And they would thank me afterwards, send me an email thanking me. I had a number on the night table. It was comforting to know that I could call you. And you think about it and you say, how could we relate? We can't relate to that. So I think as a takeaway, I think
I think Rabbi Horowitz is frozen.
Yeah, I think we froze.
Okay, Rabbi Horowitz, are you with us? Okay, I think we'll get back to him. Can I direct the question to you, Tali, of what's your takeaway from this?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of people want to know when things are going to go back to how they were. And I don't think that things are going to go back to how they were. As a matter of fact, I think post-corona growth means, things not going back to where they were, but learning something valuable. And I think that the way that they were, at least for me and for many, many, many people who I've spoken to, life was just kind of doing. It was about doing and not about being. And, we have a way of running away from our problems. We have a way of avoiding conflict and sweeping things under the rug. And when a crisis comes, you're forced to deal with it. You're forced to sit with it. And I think that it's an opportunity to stop running and sit with our feelings, sit with our sensations, sit with our thoughts, learn to notice things, learn to use intention and be mindful. And I think that this is something that a lot of people have been able to utilize so that the values that are taken from this crisis are that ability to be with feelings, be with stuff that isn't always so positive, and that's okay too. And we need to stop running, and we need to be able to give ourselves those opportunities to notice what's going on in us and around us.
Thank you, Rabbi Horowitz. I want to give the mic back to you figuratively to finish off your thought.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I lost my connection. I think you got it. No, I was just. I don't know when you lost me, but I was just speaking about the notion that we should try to understand the very, very different lives this has. In other words, people who are single have always dealt with the loneliness of being single, but it was different. And they were able to go to people's homes. People who had challenges, Kanehara, with children and raising teenagers, 75 kids, Kanehara, it was always happening, but it just gets more, and the other folks don't understand it. So that's just on a strictly on a human level, to try to be able to empathize and try to understand to the best of our ability that other people have very different realities than we do.
Thank you. Dr. Gatz, what's your takeaway?
I think that the takeaway that I would think about is that we need to take more seriously the idea that families are essential, which sounds strange because everyone, you say our family is important. Of course, families are important. And yet I've been continually frustrated by how we have responded to balancing the need for family with the need for safety. For some reason, with economic activity, everyone kind of gets, all right, we got to get back to working. And there's a balance between staying safe and making money and making sure the economy keeps on going. And we can think with complexity there. I mean, to a certain extent, I think politics divides us and sort of moves us into polarities. But we can usually think about, okay, the notion of balancing economic activity with safety is uncontroversial. And yet somehow with families, we remain in this binary. It's either or. Either we go see families, we go see our family, and who cares about Corona? Or if you visit family, you are the worst person in the entire world. People typically vote with their feet, and I think that the abject failure of people to not see family shouldn't be responded to with finger wagging. It should tell us something. Right? It should tell us that families are really important, both nuclear families, extended families. We can't live without them. And again, while that's a very seemingly mundane and a statement that everyone could get on board with, somehow when push comes to shove, we don't really take it all that seriously. And I would hope that one of the things that we take from this is recognizing that family is an essential service. Right? We really need to think about a more complex way of balancing safety and family, and just recognizing that you can't live without, living without family is fairly empty.
Okay. There was one more question that I want to address from the audience, and I'm just going to open this to the panelists, whoever feels that they can contribute, about special needs children. How can we handle special needs children? It's so difficult to be able to function with extra stresses that we never had. And again, these children don't understand boundaries and can't necessarily have this dialogue.
Yeah, I think that the concept of special needs children is a useful one, but it could sometimes hide more than it illuminates. We really need to know what is the special need of the child. In what sense is the special need the special need of the child? In what sense is it limiting? What strength does it give? If we're talking about a special needs kid who is ADHD, so then when we talk about enacting boundaries, having long conversations with that kid is probably not a good idea, right? So there we need to be thinking about very quick messaging, really having a more visceral sense of where the boundaries stand, and being very, very active with them. If the special need is a child with some cognitive deficiency, so again, when we enact boundaries, we have to make sure that they're ones that they can understand. If they're the child on the spectrum, so the limitation there will be that our normal means of connection might be blocked, and so we need to adapt ourselves in order to make sure that we can still connect in a way that the child can understand. So I think that the first intervention when we think about how do we respond to special needs child is to take it out of the broad concept of a special need and think about what are the specific pathways that are either blocked or opened with the special need of that child.
Thank you. I'm going to read a comment. This is not a question, but I think it's something that's nice to end with. A big shout out to all the parents who are home with kids. I'm a bubby and I stand in awe of your strength. I don't think I could have handled it, and I give you huge credit. So on that positive note, thank you all for joining. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights. And thank you to all of our participants. And we look forward to continuing to work with the community in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rivka, and thank you, Tali. Thank you, Rabbi Horowitz, if you're still here. Oh, there you are.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was really a pleasure. I learned a lot. Thank you.